This amplifier on the bench this evening is a Audiolab 8000A. Renowned back in the 90s, I suppose the late 90s, early 2000s, for being a very good audio quality amplifier. British built, tone defeats and things like that, all the things that the purists want. I think they're rated at 100 watts RMS per channel, I'm not entirely sure. Now these still actually fetch quite good prices on eBay, and I bought this one actually on the Facebook page, and I bought this for a very good price, sort of like a third of what you'd pay on Facebook for on eBay for an amplifier of the same sort of quality or in the same condition. So this is the Audiolab 8000A. Now I did have one of these years ago, but it was in such a state I just gave up with it in the end. These do suffer from a problem with everything. All the components on these amplifiers are a little bit underrated, and everything runs too hot, and eventually what can happen is they can burn the board away and actually fail, and I'll show you that in a minute. But these are, as I say, a renowned amplifier for being good quality, and the chap who was selling this actually took the cover off to show the insides, and it clearly had discoloration on the printed circuit board, which is normal for these amplifiers. But he said he was guaranteed working, and he's basically, because it's a Facebook page, he's 5 minutes up the road, so it's and you could tell he was a pretty genuine sort of seller. He was selling some other gear as well. So I really bought this possibly with the intention of replacing my Pioneer A400 at home with this amplifier. But first of all, obviously we need to see if it's going to work properly, have a look inside, see what the capacitors are like, see if it does need any work doing to it, and from there we'll ascertain if it's worth actually using this amplifier or not. Okay, here's the rear connections here, and it's got the standard IEC mains lead as you expect from an amplifier this time. Switching speaker connections, and interestingly enough all the terminals are all gold plated, all phono inputs. All gold plated. Usually you'd only get gold plated contacts on a amplifier with the maybe the phono input. It's got a phono input section here, which for selectable moving coil and moving magnet, and you just select the input you want there, and the rest of them we've got quite a few inputs actually: tuner, CD, video, tape 1, tape 2, and a preamp power amp coupling socket. Now that's interesting because I'm not sure if this chap has actually checked it, but the preamp power amp links are missing. So basically what that means is there's no way of testing the amplifier, because there's no way of fitting audio into the amplifier unless there's an internal switch, which I'm pretty sure there isn't. But you can see here that that's the preamp output on the right and the main amplifier in. If they're not coupled, basically you won't get any sound out of the thing. So I think the next thing to do is probably just power it up, connect it up to a set of speakers, and see if we get any audio at all. So let's do that. Okay, let's connected it up. It doesn't need that preamp power amp linkage. It's obviously both those connections are wired in parallel, but it certainly, I've powered it up and it seems to work without that. So let's connect some audio up to it and see what it sounds like. All seems to work okay. Tone controls work. They're quite subtle on this. They're only plus 8 dB, so you probably won't hear it through the internal microphone. It's treble boost, that's working. Funny enough, the speaker connection only works on the second set of speakers, so that makes no difference at all. Controls are quiet, all the switches seem to be okay. So it looks like this amplifier is in pretty good nick actually. So I think the probably thing to do is whip the cover off and have a look inside. Okay, I've opened it up inside, and it's in pretty nice condition. I don't know if you can see what I'm talking about here. You see this brown area around these resistors? That's all because these little TR4 resistors, or whatever they are, run red hot, and they are hot now. They're sort of like 80 degrees C. It just discolours the board eventually. Of course, what it does is it eventually causes dry joints and causes problems with the amplifier. These are our output drivers here. These with the heatsink bolted to them, TO220 style. They are burning hot. This is our output stage here, which is use these huge Sankin transistors. It's Sankin SKA 1218, capable of producing very large, high current capabilities for short periods. Massive toroidal transformer in here as well. This is where all the audio is transferred through to the switch gear. We've got this linear regulator here that looks like runs the phono amplifier. That plate of that side of that amplifier is red hot. I mean, I can barely hold my hand on that. That's got to be 70 degrees C or so. Phono stage, which is renowned for being quite good for us, sort of like an integrated amplifier. Good quality capacitors. They look like Rubicons possibly. Can't see the name on them at the moment. No, there's no. Can't see a name, but they certainly look like good quality capacitors. All the other capacitors here all look okay. There's nothing, no sign of bulging. Power supply, sort of like electrolytics here. Can't see the make of those at the moment either, but they're going to be good quality capacitors. They're not. Audiolab didn't skimp on quality of the components. They just underrated the amplifier slightly. There's the emitter follow resistors there. Excuse me. Emitter follow resistors there, which you'll probably need to get into to check the bias on the output stage. The amplifier does run very hot, and the output stage, even though it hasn't been driven very hard, is sort of like 40 degrees, 45 degrees. I'd like to bring that down a bit. I don't think that's necessary. It might affect the total harmonic distortion at a low level, but I'm not particularly worried about that. I'll check the spec. I'll download the manual in a minute. So it all looks in pretty nice condition actually. It's hasn't been molested by anyone, and it's in clean. There's not a lot of dust in here. The only thing I would say about these amplifiers is they do need a maximum amount of ventilation. The top vent only vents the heatsink. There's no ventilation for the rest of the amplifier. And there's quite a lot of heat dissipated by these driver transistors here, this linear regulator, and all these resistors here. So that heat is trapped inside, which is something that I think is a bit of a shortcoming with this amplifier. The ventilation in the grills on the top could be better, and that would prevent this sort of like this discoloration of the board and burning of the board. So yeah, it all looks fine inside. I'm going to check the specs and then have a look to see what the quiescent current's like. Well, clearly the amplifier works okay, so I'm just going to do a couple of fundamental checks just to make sure everything's set up right. Now the bias adjustment on these isn't done by a variable resistor, which is unusual. It seems to be done by a couple of resistors, like a divider circuit, so we were going to assume that's okay. The amplifier does run quite warm in an idle state, I must admit, but we could always check the bias current if we think that's wrong, but I personally think that if it's been set with a couple of sort of resistors, it's probably fine. None of these components have never been changed from what I can see. There's no sign of any rework on this amplifier. What I'm looking at the moment is the output offset on the amplifier, and this is the DC output. Because this is a direct coupled amplifier, you can actually adjust the 0 point of the amplifier so it's always at 0 volts. And we're looking here, we can see we're actually at more or less 0. We're on 300 millivolt range, and we're showing less than 500 microvolts, so that's extremely low offset. That's very good. So that channel's okay. I'm just going to remove that connection. Let me swap the other lead over, and we'll try the other channel. Okay, the next test will be do a power check on it just to see how much output it makes. Do a distortion figure as well, just to see if it's working within sort of manufacturer's specifications. So we're going to start with an amplitude of 1 volt is fine, a frequency of 1 kilohertz. We're going to feed that into the amplifier and its auxiliary input, or actually it's video input. I don't think you call them auxiliary anymore. Video input. And then we're going to push it just short of clipping, and then we're going to see what level it makes. So We're on AC level, so let's just push it off to clipping. We're making 23.85 volts. Distortion factor is 0.089%. It's just coming onto clipping, so that's pretty good. And then we'll check our distortion. This is both channels driven. It makes a difference actually, the power level, when you're measuring two channels, because obviously you're taking more current from the power supply if you're driving both channels, so it affects the output of the amplifier. So we'll do a 19.08. So 19.08 special function. Now the display showing power into 8 ohms on the right hand channel. Let's wind this back up again. There we go, just off the clipping again. On the onset of clipping, it's making about 73, 74 watts. Just into clipping it's running about 78 watts. So clearly making its specification no problem at all. Then we could do another check, and this is the signal to noise ratio check, and it's not necessarily that accurate with my setup because I'm using an isolation transformer on this analyzer. But we go shifted signal to noise ratio, and you can see what it's doing now. It's pulsing the input of the amplifier. Let's move this back up so you can see it a bit clearer. It's pulsing the input of the amplifier, and what it's doing is it's measuring the reference. The reference will be the zero input, and then the drive, and that's the difference between the input and the output. That's at 82 dB. Obviously, it depends on what level you put into the amplifier, but just short of clipping. Get back to short of clipping again. It's just clipping there. It's about 82, 83 dB, which is probably well below what it's actually capable of. I think this amplifier is probably sort of like 90 dB or something like that. But as I say, because we're running on isolation transformers and things, we get earth loops and things like that. So there is probably a bit of fundamental 50 Hertz pickup. So basically, this amplifier seems to be working fine, and no problem at all with it. The only thing I can say to end this video is these amplifiers are very nice. They sound very good, but there's not an amplifier I would recommend you leave on overnight, or when you're not using it. Don't think just leave it on to keep it warm because it's going to sound better. I would shut it off. The ventilation on these amplifiers is inadequate in my opinion. I would like to see grills put here so the whole thing doesn't build up with heat. We've got this TO220 linear regulator on the side of this chassis here. It generates a lot of heat. We've obviously got the heat sinks are fairly well ventilated, but we've got all the TR4 resistors here, or these MFR4s or whatever they are. These resistors run very hot. As you can see, I could hardly touch them, they were so hot. They're inadequately cooled in my opinion. They're underrated resistors, and that's what causes the discoloration on the board, and after a long period of time actually burns the board away. I did have another one of these amplifiers I actually scrapped in the end because the board was so badly burnt it just wasn't worth keeping. The only thing I kept was a couple of sort of transistors and some of the more sort of useful components. So yeah, nice amplifier, very capable. Still a very good high quality amplifier for all the audiophiles out there. I know people like all the Gear No Idea thinks that all this is a bit of a joke. Yeah, okay, that's his opinion. Some amplifiers do sound better than others. I'm not that fussy. I mean, quite honestly, if I was an audiophile, I wouldn't be using this Technics SUV 505. A lot of people say it sounds harsh. It sounds alright to me. So yeah, good amplifier. I hope it was of some interest. Thanks for watching.